Sometimes the heaviest burden isn't what we carry, but what we've lost along the way. In the frozen village of Korrstad, two sisters learned this truth when death took their father and the wilderness swallowed their brothers whole. Signe and Runa now guard their family's longhouse alone, trusting no one who comes to their door. Then a giant named Halvor Iceborn arrives carrying two wooden crates and asks for something simple, a place to sleep. Most travelers want food or coin. This stranger just wants rest. The sisters let him stay, but they watch him closely. During that long winter night, old secrets begin to stir. When dawn breaks, Signe makes Halvor an offer that stops him cold. What could a grieving sister say that would freeze a battle-hardened Viking in his tracks? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind that swept across Korrstad carried more than snow. It carried the weight of memory, the echo of voices that would never again call out across the frozen courtyard. Signe pressed her face against the thick glass of the longhouse window, her breath fogging the surface as she watched the last light of day fade behind the mountains. The glass itself was a treasure in this remote place, brought by traders when her father still lived, when their family name still commanded respect across the northern settlements. "He's still out there," Runa said from behind her, the words spoken soft but edged with concern. "Been standing by those crates for near an hour now." Signe didn't turn from the window. Through the frosted panes, she could see the massive silhouette of their unexpected guest, Halvor Iceborn, motionless as a carved stone beside the two wooden boxes he'd carried through the gates. The man stood like a mountain himself, broad shoulders draped in a cloak that had seen countless winters, his beard white with frost that never seemed to melt completely away. "Father would have sent him on his way before the sun touched the horizon," Runa continued, moving to stand beside her twin. "Strangers bring trouble, especially ones who travel alone in weather like this. Their father, Chieftain Magnus the Stoutheart, who had ruled Korrstad with wisdom, earned through 40 years of keeping the peace between feuding clans, managing trade routes that stretched to the far southern kingdoms, and raising children who understood that leadership meant sacrifice. He'd been gone 3 months now, taken by a fever that had swept through the settlement like wildfire, leaving behind 2 daughters who'd learned governance at his knee but had never expected to inherit so soon. The longhouse around them bore witness to better times. Carved beams stretched overhead, each one telling a story of their ancestors' victories in intricate Nordic designs that had taken craftsmen years to complete. Tapestries hung along the walls, woven by their grandmothers' hands, depicting scenes of great hunts and legendary feasts, when this hall had been filled with laughter and the clatter of drinking horns. Now the space felt vast and empty, their footsteps echoing in chambers built to house dozens of kinsmen. "Erik and Bjorn should have been back by now," Signe murmured, her words creating another small cloud against the glass. Their elder brothers had departed 6 weeks ago, leading a hunting party into the deep wilderness to track a wounded bear that had been terrorizing outlying farms. It should have been a 3-week journey at most. "They've never been gone this long without sending word." Runa's hand found her sister's shoulder, a gesture of comfort they'd shared countless times since childhood. Though they were twins, born mere minutes apart, the sisters had grown into women as different as summer and winter. Signe carried herself with their father's diplomatic bearing, always thinking 3 moves ahead, weighing consequences before action. Runa had inherited their mother's fierce spirit, quick to defend what she loved, her hand never far from the sword at her hip. "The deep snows came early this year," Runa said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Perhaps they're waiting out the storms in one of the old hunting lodges." Both sisters knew that Erik, at 28, was too experienced a woodsman to be trapped by weather, and Bjorn's skill with tracking was legendary throughout the region. Their silence spoke louder than any words of worry they might have shared. The longhouse itself seemed to mourn with them. Built by their great-grandfather, using timber from the sacred grove, every board and beam carried the weight of family history. The great hearth that dominated the main hall had warmed 4 generations of their bloodline, its stones blackened by countless fires that had brought comfort to weary travelers and light to dark winter nights. Now it felt like a monument to what they'd lost, rather than a promise of warmth to come. A soft knock at the thick oak door interrupted their vigil. Signe and Runa exchanged glances. Visitors after dark were unusual and dangerous. "That'll be old Henrik," Runa said, recognizing the gentle rhythm of the knock. "He's been checking on us every evening since father passed." Signe moved to answer the door, grateful for the interruption to her darkening thoughts. Henrik the Grey stood on their threshold, his weathered face creased with concern beneath the hood of his worn cloak. At 65, he was one of the few remaining men of their father's generation, a former warrior who'd settled into the role of the village's unofficial keeper of wisdom. "Evening, daughters of Magnus," Henrik said, stamping snow from his boots before stepping inside. "I bring news, though I'm not certain if it's welcome or troubling." "Come by the fire," Signe offered, leading him toward the hearth, where red coals still glowed with warmth. "Tell us what weighs on your mind." Henrik settled onto one of the wooden benches that surrounded the fire pit, his joints creaking with age and old injuries. "It's about your guest," he began, nodding toward the window where Halvor's silhouette was still visible. "I've been asking questions, speaking with the few traders who've passed through this season." "And?" Runa prompted, taking a seat across from him. "The name Halvor Iceborn isn't unknown in the northern settlements," Henrik said slowly, as if weighing each word, "though the man bearing it was supposed to have died 5 years past, somewhere in the far eastern territories." Signe felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with the winter air seeping through the walls. "You're certain of this?" "As certain as old memory allows," Henrik replied. "The Halvor Iceborn I heard tell of was a war leader, a man who commanded respect and fear in equal measure. They called him the Winter. Wolf said he could track enemies through blizzards that would blind other men, fight with the fury of the old gods when pushed to violence." The 3 of them sat in contemplative silence, the crackling of the fire the only sound in the vast hall. Through the window, they could see that their mysterious guest had finally moved, picking up his wooden crates and approaching the longhouse. "If he truly is who he claims to be," Henrik continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "then his presence here is no accident. Men like that don't simply wander into remote settlements seeking shelter. They come with purpose, and that purpose isn't always peaceful." Runa's hand instinctively moved to her sword hilt. "Perhaps we should have turned him away." "Perhaps," Signe agreed, though something in her heart resisted the idea. There had been something in the stranger's eyes when he'd asked for shelter, not the calculating coldness of a threat, but the deep weariness of a man, carrying burdens too heavy for one soul to bear. But father always said that hospitality to travelers was sacred, especially in winter. To turn away a man seeking only rest would bring dishonor to our family name. Heavy footsteps approached the door, followed by another knock, this one deeper, more deliberate than Henrik's gentle tap. "That'll be him now," Runa said, rising from her seat. "What do we do?" Signe studied the faces of the 2 people she trusted most in the world, her twin sister, whose courage had never wavered even in their darkest hours, and Henrik, whose wisdom had guided their family through countless challenges. In their eyes, she saw reflection of her own uncertainty, but also trust in whatever decision she would make. "We honor our father's teachings," she said finally, moving toward the door. "We offer hospitality, but we remain watchful. If Halvor Iceborn has come to Korrstad with peaceful intent, he'll find welcome here. If not—" She paused, her own hand moving to rest on the pommel of her blade. "Then he'll discover that Magnus the Stoutheart raised daughters who know how to defend what's theirs." The knock came again, patient but persistent, and Signe stepped forward to open the door to whatever destiny awaited them all. Halvor Iceborn stood in the doorway like a force of nature given human form. Even bent slightly forward in a gesture of respect, his massive frame filled the entrance completely, blocking out the swirling snow behind him. Ice crystals clung to his dark beard, and his pale blue eyes held depths that spoke of winters survived and battles witnessed. The two wooden crates sat at his feet, their surfaces weathered smooth but still solid, bound with iron straps that gleamed dully in the firelight. "I thank you for the shelter," he said, his voice carrying the rumble of distant thunder. "The wind carries teeth tonight." Signe stepped back to allow him entry, studying his face for any sign of deception or threat. What she saw instead was exhaustion so profound it seemed carved into his very bones. This was not the expression of a man planning violence, but rather someone who had traveled too far and carried too much for too long. "You're welcome to our fire and our protection while the storm rages," she said formally, the words their father had taught her for receiving travelers. "I am Signe, daughter of Magnus. This is my sister, Runa, and Henrik the Grey, keeper of our village's memory." Halvor nodded to each of them in turn, his movements deliberate and respectful. When he straightened fully inside the hall, his head nearly brushed the carved beams overhead. "I am in your debt for this kindness. In my travels I have learned that hospitality in winter is the difference between life and death." Henrik studied the stranger with sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Your accent carries notes of the Eastern Territories, yet your name suggests northern heritage. You've traveled far from home." "All men are far from home eventually," Halvor replied, deflecting the implied question with practiced ease. He gestured toward his wooden crates. "I carry trade goods and personal effects, nothing that would bring danger to your house." Runa's gaze fixed on the crates with suspicion. "Trade goods? In winter?" Most merchants finished their routes before the deep snows. For the first time, something flickered across Halvor's weathered features, a momentary tightening around his eyes that suggested her observation had struck close to something he preferred to keep hidden. "Some journeys cannot wait for favorable seasons," he said simply. The great hall fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the wind howling around the longhouse walls and the crackling of burning logs in the hearth. Signe felt the weight of decision settling on her shoulders. Everything about this situation felt charged with significance beyond a simple request for shelter. Henrik's warnings echoed in her mind, mixing with her father's teachings about hospitality and her own instincts about the man before them. "Henrik speaks truly about the name you carry," she said finally. "Halvor Iceborn was said to be a war leader in the eastern lands. A man of that name reportedly died 5 years past." Halvor's massive hands clenched and relaxed at his sides, the only outward sign that her words affected him. "Names are like rivers. Sometimes they flow underground for long stretches before emerging again into the light. Men have been known to take on new lives when old ones become unbearable." The admission hung heavy in the air between them. It was neither confirmation nor denial, but acknowledgement that the situation was far more complex than a simple traveler seeking shelter. "What brings you to Korrstad?" Runa asked bluntly, her warrior's instincts demanding direct answers. "This settlement isn't on any major trade route. Men don't find their way here by accident." Halvor turned his pale gaze toward her, and for a moment Signe saw something ancient and sorrowful in his eyes. "I carry something that belongs to this place," he said, "a debt that has waited too long to be settled." Henrik leaned forward, his expression growing more alert. "What manner of debt?" "The kind that weighs on a man's soul until he can no longer bear the burden," Halvor replied. "I knew Magnus the Stoutheart in years past, before he became chieftain of this place. We served together in the campaign against the coastal raiders when your father was still young and hungry for glory." Signe felt her breath catch. Her father had indeed fought in that legendary campaign 30 years ago, though he'd spoken little of those days in his later years. She'd always sensed there were memories from that time that brought him pain rather than pride. "Father rarely spoke of the war years," she said carefully. "He told us only that good men died far from home and that victory always carries a price." "Magnus was wise to focus on what came after rather than what was lost," Halvor said, his voice heavy with old grief. "But some of us who survived carried wounds that never properly healed. I have spent these years wandering, trying to find peace with choices made in the heat of battle." He moved toward his wooden crates, kneeling beside them with surprising grace for such a large man. His hands traced the iron bindings with reverence, as if touching something sacred. "These crates contain the personal effects of 3 men who died under my command during that campaign. I swore an oath to see their belongings returned to their families, but life and circumstances kept me from fulfilling that promise." The simple words transformed the atmosphere in the hall completely. What had moments before felt like potential danger now revealed itself as something far more profound. A warrior's attempt to honor the dead and find absolution for old failures. 30 years, Henrik said softly. "You've carried this burden for 30 years. Some promises cannot be abandoned simply because they become inconvenient," Halvor replied. "I learned through traveling merchants that Magnus had taken chieftainship of Korrstad, that he'd built a good life here with family and prosperity. I hoped he might know what became of the families of the men who died, or at least could help me learn where they might be laid to rest." Signe exchanged glances with her sister and saw her own emotional turmoil reflected in Runa's eyes. This revelation cast their father's later years in new light, his deep commitment to hospitality, his insistence that debts of honor must always be paid, his careful attention to the needs of families who had lost men to war or misfortune. "Father died 3 months ago," she said gently. "But his records are preserved, and his memory of those he served with remained clear until his final days." Halvor's shoulders sagged, as if invisible weight had suddenly doubled. "Then I am too late to seek his forgiveness for my failures." "Perhaps," Runa said, her voice softer than before, "you've arrived at exactly the right time to find peace." The wind outside intensified, rattling the shutters and sending drafts through gaps in the walls. But inside the hall, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the weight of shared understanding, something had fundamentally changed. The stranger at their door was no longer a potential threat, but a man carrying ghosts who might finally find rest. The night settled deeper around the longhouse as Halvor carefully opened the first of his wooden crates. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather and wool, lay the preserved belongings of warriors who had fallen 3 decades past. Signe watched his massive hands handle each item with the reverence of a priest tending sacred relics: a silver arm ring bearing runic inscriptions, a bone-handled knife with intricate carvings, a small wooden figurine of a raven that had been worn smooth by countless touches. "Thorvald Ravenspeaker owned this," Halvor said, lifting the figurine with infinite care. "He carried it through 7 campaigns, claimed his father carved it when Thorvald was still learning to walk. Said the raven would guide his spirit home if he fell in battle." Henrik leaned closer, his old eyes studying the craftsmanship. "I remember hearing tales of Ravenspeaker. They said he could speak with the spirits of the battlefield, that he never led men into fights they couldn't win." "Until the last one," Halvor replied quietly. "We were tracking coastal raiders through the marshlands near Steinvik. The enemy had taken hostages from 3 villages, and time was running short. Thorvald insisted we could approach their camp through the bog channels, use the mist as cover for a dawn assault." He set the figurine down gently, his expression distant as memory pulled him back across the years. "The plan should have worked, would have worked, if I hadn't been so eager to prove myself as a leader. I pushed the men too hard, moved too fast through terrain I didn't fully understand." Runa found herself drawn into the story despite her earlier suspicions. "What happened?" "We stumbled into a trap that had been set for exactly the kind of approach Thorvald suggested. The raiders had learned to think like Vikings, to anticipate our tactics. Halvor's voice carried the weight of old guilt. 3 good men died because I was too proud to listen to counsel from those more experienced. Signe studied the artifacts spread before them, each one representing a life cut short and a family left to wonder about their loved one's fate. These belongings, you've carried them all these years, seeking their families? I've found 2 of them, Halvor said. Thorvald's son lives in a settlement 4 days' ride south of here. He's grown old, wondering what became of his father's body, whether his spirit found proper rest. When I placed this figurine in his hands last summer, I watched 30 years of questions finally find answers. He reached into the crate again, withdrawing a leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of metal coins. Magnus spoke often of his home in those days, of the woman he planned to marry when the campaigns ended, of the children he hoped to raise in a place where they could grow strong without knowing war. The words struck Signe like physical blows. Her father had indeed married young, had spent his early years as chieftain, working tirelessly to ensure Korrstad remained peaceful and prosperous. She'd never fully understood the driving force behind his commitment to diplomacy over warfare, but now she glimpsed the foundation of that dedication. He succeeded in that dream, she said softly. We grew up knowing safety, understanding that strength sometimes meant choosing not to fight. Henrik nodded slowly, his weathered hands clasped before him. Magnus rarely spoke of the war years, but when he did, there was always sorrow mixed with the pride. He told me once that the measure of a leader wasn't the battles he won, but the battles he prevented. Halvor's pale eyes fixed on something beyond the firelight, seeing scenes that existed only in memory. Your father saved my life during that final engagement. When the raiders' trap closed around us, when it became clear that retreat was our only option, Magnus stayed behind to hold the line, while the rest of us carried out our wounded and dead. The revelation hung in the air like smoke from the hearth, carrying implications that Signe was only beginning to understand. Her father, the man she'd known as a devoted leader and loving parent, had been shaped by experiences that ran deeper than anything she'd imagined. He never told us of that, Runa said, her voice barely above a whisper. Men who do truly heroic things rarely speak of them, Henrik observed. They carry the weight of their choices quietly, letting their later actions speak to what they learned from their trials. Halvor reached deeper into the crate, his expression growing more solemn. When his hand emerged, it held a bundle wrapped in silk that had been dyed deep blue, the color of nobility and high station. He handled it with even greater care than the previous items, as if it contained something both precious and dangerous. The third man who died was named Eirik Goldenheart, he said. He was barely 20, the youngest son of a wealthy merchant family from the southern territories. He joined our company seeking adventure and glory, dreaming of returning home with tales that would make him worthy of his father's respect. Signe felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter winds rattling the shutters. Something in Halvor's tone suggested this particular loss carried weight beyond simple regret for a young life ended too soon. What did he carry? She asked, though part of her dreaded the answer. Halvor's hands hesitated on the silk wrapping, and for a moment the mighty warrior looked like a man standing at the edge of a precipice. A betrothal ring, he said finally, gold set with garnets from the far eastern mines. He'd planned to present it to his beloved when he returned from campaign to ask her father for permission to marry. He unwrapped the silk carefully, revealing a ring that caught the firelight, and threw it back in warm red gleams. Even after 30 years of careful preservation, its beauty was unmistakable, the work of master craftsmen who had created something meant to symbolize a lifetime of love and devotion. Eirik spoke of his intended every night around the campfire. Halvor continued, a merchant's daughter from a settlement in the northern reaches, a woman he'd met during a trading expedition. He described her as brave and intelligent, said she could run a trading post better than most men, and wasn't afraid of hard work or difficult decisions. The silence, that followed seemed to stretch for eternity. In the depths of her heart, Signe felt understanding beginning to dawn, a terrible, wonderful recognition that explained so many things about their current situation that had seemed like mere coincidence. "What was her name?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Halvor met her eyes directly, and in his gaze she saw reflection of her own growing realization. "Astrid Magnusdottir," he said quietly, "your mother." The betrothal ring lay between them like a bridge spanning 30 years of secrets and silence. Signe stared at the garnets that gleamed in the firelight, each red stone a reminder of love that had never bloomed, promises that had died in distant marshlands before they could be fulfilled. The weight of revelation pressed down upon the hall like the deep snows outside, heavy and transformative. "Our mother," Runa breathed, her voice hollow with shock. She never spoke of any betrothal before father. "We believed theirs was the only love she'd ever known." Henrik shifted uncomfortably on his bench, his weathered face reflecting the struggle between discretion and truth. Astrid came to Korrstad as a young woman. Before the campaigns ended, she arrived alone, carrying only what she could fit in a single traveling pack. Magnus was already smitten before she'd been here a week. Halvor's massive hands cradled the ring as if it were a newborn bird, fragile beyond measure. I watched Eirik practice his proposal speech around our campfires. He'd stand apart from the others in the evening, speaking to the wind and stars. Rehearsing words he was convinced would make Astrid see him as more than just another merchant's son, seeking profit from her family's trading connections. The fire crackled and settled, sending shadows dancing across the carved beams overhead. Signe found herself struggling to reconcile this new image of her mother, a young woman caught between two potential futures, one represented by adventure and uncertainty, the other by stability and deep affection. Did she know he was coming back for her? Signe asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Eirik sent messages through the trading networks, Halvor replied. Letters expressing his devotion, promises of the life they would build together when the campaigns ended. The last message reached her settlement 2 weeks before our final engagement, before he fell. Runa stood abruptly and moved to the window, pressing her palms against the cold glass as if she could push away the revelations, threatening to reshape everything she'd believed about her family's history. So our mother waited for a dead man who never came home, then found love with our father. There's no shame in that story. No shame at all, Halvor agreed, his tone gentle but carrying undertones of deeper complexity. But there's more to the tale than simple replacement of one love with another. Your mother's choices in those days shaped more than just her own future. Henrik cleared his throat, a sound that carried decades of carefully kept confidences. Astrid was already with child when she married Magnus. The timing of your brother's birth, if one counts back carefully from the wedding date, suggests they were conceived before the marriage vows were spoken. The words fell into the hall like stones into still water, creating ripples of understanding that spread outward in all directions. Signe felt her world tilting as implications became clear. Erik and Bjorn, the elder brothers who had vanished into the wilderness 6 weeks past, might not share the same father she and Runa had always assumed. "You're saying our brothers are Eirik's sons?" Runa asked, turning from the window with eyes that burned like coals. "I'm saying the timing suggests possibilities," Henrik replied carefully. Astrid never spoke directly of the matter, and Magnus never questioned the children's parentage. He claimed them as his own from their first breath, and loved them no differently than the daughters who came later. Halvor set the betrothal ring down on the wooden table with infinite care, then reached into the silk, wrapping to withdraw a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age, but still intact. "This is the last letter Eirik wrote to your mother, finished the night before we marched into the marshlands. He never had chance to send it." With trembling hands, Signe accepted the letter. The parchment felt brittle beneath her fingers, weighted with words that had waited 3 decades to reach their intended recipient. She unfolded it carefully, revealing script that had been penned with obvious care and deep emotion. "My beloved Astrid," she read aloud, her voice catching on words that carried the passion of a young man dreaming of his future. "Each day of this campaign brings me closer to the moment I can return to your side and speak the words that burn in my heart. I carry your memory, like a flame that warms me through the coldest nights and gives me courage when facing uncertain dawn." She paused, overwhelmed by the intimacy of reading love letters meant for eyes that had closed forever. But something compelled her to continue, as if Eirik's spirit demanded that his words finally reach the woman who had waited for him. "I have spoken with the other men about their plans for after the war, and I realize that my dreams are simpler than most. I want nothing more than to wake each morning beside you, to build a life where our children can grow strong and free from the shadows that have darkened these lands. The ring I carry was my grandmother's, passed down through 3 generations of women who understood that true wealth lies not in gold or silver, but in hearts that choose to bind themselves together against whatever storms may come." Tears blurred Signe's vision as she reached the letter's conclusion. "I know that asking you to wait for me requires faith beyond what any woman should be asked to give. But I swear by all the gods of my fathers that I will return to you, that we will speak our vows beneath the northern stars, that our love will become legend in the halls of our grandchildren. Until that blessed day, I remain your devoted servant and the guardian of dreams we will soon make real. All my love, Eirik." The silence that followed felt sacred, as if they were sitting in a temple rather than a longhouse. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving only the soft whisper of falling snow against the windows and the gentle crackle of burning logs. "She kept his memory alive in her heart," Halvor said finally. "But she also chose to embrace the life that became possible when grief gave way to new love. Magnus gave her stability and devotion that transcended questions of bloodlines or previous attachments." Runa returned to sit beside her sister, her warrior's composure cracked but not broken. "And now you've come to deliver a dead man's ring to a woman who's been in her grave for 8 years. I've come to honor promises made to a dying friend and to offer whatever peace can still be found," Halvor replied. "The ring belongs to Eirik's bloodline, if such exists. The choice of what to do with it belongs to those who understand the full weight of its history." Signe folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Halvor, but her eyes remained fixed on the betrothal ring that had traveled so far to reach its intended destination. In its gleaming surface, she saw reflections of choices made and unmade, of love that had persevered despite separation and death, of family bonds that transcended simple biology. "Our brothers," she said slowly. "If they truly are Eirik's sons, then this ring is their inheritance. And they've been missing for 6 weeks, Runa added grimly, vanished into the same kind of wilderness that claimed their true father." The convergence of past and present settled around them like fate itself, binding their choices to consequences that reached back through decades of carefully buried truth. Dawn crept across the frozen landscape with hesitant fingers of pale light, illuminating a world transformed by the night's snowfall. Signe stood at the eastern window of the longhouse, watching the sun struggle to break through heavy clouds that promised more storms to come. Sleep had eluded her through the dark hours, her mind churning with revelations that recast her entire understanding of family and heritage. Behind her, the great hall bore evidence of the night's extraordinary conversation. Halvor's wooden crates remained open on the central table, their contents arranged with careful reverence, artifacts of lives cut short and promises unfulfilled. The giant himself sat motionless before the dying fire, his massive frame folded into meditation so deep he might have been carved from stone. Runa emerged from the kitchens, carrying a wooden tray laden with bread, cheese, and steaming bowls of porridge sweetened with preserved berries. She moved with quiet efficiency, her warrior's training evident in every controlled gesture, But Signe could see tension in her sister's shoulders that spoke of sleepless hours spent wrestling with impossible truths. "Onric left before first light," Runa said softly, setting the tray on a side table. "He wanted to check the village records, see what documentation might exist regarding our family's early years in Korrstad." Halvor stirred at the sound of her voice, unfolding from his contemplative pose with the fluid grace of a much younger man. Despite his size and the evident weight of his years, he moved like someone whose body remained a finely tuned instrument of survival. "Your hospitality honors the memory of your parents," he said, accepting a bowl of porridge with hands that dwarfed the wooden vessel. "In my wanderings, I have learned that true nobility lies not in bloodlines or titles, but in how we choose to part us. Treat those who depend upon our kindness." Signe joined them at the table, though her appetite had disappeared sometime during the previous night's revelations. The food tasted like ash in her mouth, every swallow accompanied by thoughts of brothers who might be carrying the blood of a man they'd never known existed. "Tell us about our brothers as children," she said abruptly, needing to understand connections she'd never recognized. Did they show signs of their true heritage? Halvor considered the question while breaking bread with careful deliberation. "I knew Eirik for only 6 months, but in that time I observed a young man who possessed natural leadership and instinctive understanding of tactics. He could read terrain like a scholar reads scrolls, anticipate enemy movements with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural. Eirik has always been our finest hunter," Runa said thoughtfully. "Even as a boy, he could track wounded animals through conditions that would confound experienced woodsman. And Bjorn sees patterns in chaos," Signe finished. "Give him a handful of scattered information, and he'll weave connections that reveal truths others miss completely." The description hung in the air between them, painting a picture of inherited gifts that had manifested despite ignorance of their true origin. Eirik Goldenheart's bloodline lived on in sons who had never learned his name, carrying forward talents that might have made their biological father proud. A sharp knock interrupted their breakfast, followed immediately by the sound of the door opening without invitation. Henrik entered, with snow clinging to his cloak and urgency written across his weathered features. In his hands, he carried a leather-bound ledger that Signe recognized as her father's private record book. "I've found something," he announced without preamble, settling heavily onto a bench beside the table. Magnus kept detailed accounts of the early settlement years, including notes that were never meant for outside eyes. He opened the ledger to a page marked with a strip of ribbon and began reading in a voice that carried the weight of carefully preserved secrets. "Year of the Deep Frost, entry dated 3 months after Astrid's arrival. The woman who came from the northern trading posts carries herself like one accustomed to loss, but her strength is evident in how she chooses to face forward rather than dwelling on what cannot be changed. She has agreed to marriage, though I suspect her heart still belongs partially to ghosts. I will prove worthy of whatever affection she can spare for the living." Halvor set down his spoon with a slight tremor in his massive hands. Magnus was wiser than most men to understand that love sometimes comes in stages rather than all at once. Henrik turned several pages, his fingers tracing lines of careful script. Here, written just after Eirik and Bjorn were born, the boys bear resemblance to their mother's family, though their eyes hold depths that suggest they will grow into men of significant character. I have decided that questions of biological heritage matter less than the responsibility to raise them as true sons. They will know no difference in my love or expectations. Signe felt tears threatening as she listened to her father's words echoing across the years. Magnus the Stoutheart had faced the complexities of blended family with wisdom that transcended simple concepts of blood and lineage. "There's more," Henrik continued, flipping to entries from later years. Magnus mentioned several conversations with traders who brought news from the war zones. He was specifically seeking information about men who had served in his unit, trying to learn the fates of companions who hadn't returned home. Did he know about Eirik's intentions regarding our mother? Runa asked. Henrik nodded slowly. There's an entry from the year the twins were born, meaning you two were. Magnus writes, I have learned through careful inquiry that Astrid's first love was a merchant's son named Eirik, who died in the Marshland campaign. She never spoke his name to me directly, but I see now why she sometimes grows quiet when traders speak of the eastern settlements. The boys carry his blood, and perhaps his dreams as well. I pray they will grow to honor both their birth father's memory and the lessons I can teach them about building rather than destroying. The revelation settled around them like morning mist, clarifying shapes that had been indistinct in darkness. Magnus had known the truth all along, had chosen love and acceptance over questions that might have poisoned his family's foundation. Halvor reached across the table to touch the betrothal ring with one finger, his expression distant. Your father was the best of us, even in those early campaign years. He understood that some wounds heal only through deliberate acts of grace. But understanding our heritage doesn't help us find our brothers, Signe pointed out. They've been missing for 6 weeks, and every day that passes makes their safe return less likely. Henrik closed the ledger and fixed them all with a steady gaze. Perhaps it's time to consider that their disappearance and Halvor's arrival are connected by more than simple coincidence. Men who carry the blood of natural tacticians don't vanish without reason. The implication struck like lightning, illuminating a dark landscape. If Erik and Bjorn possessed inherited talents for reading terrain and anticipating danger, their prolonged absence suggested they had encountered something beyond normal wilderness hazards, something that had challenged abilities that should have kept them safe. What do you suspect? Halvor asked, his voice dropping to a rumble that suggested controlled anger. I suspect, Henrik said carefully, that someone else knows the truth about their parentage and sees opportunity in that knowledge. The implications of Henrik's words settled over the longhouse like a shroud. Signe found herself studying Halvor's weathered features with new intensity, searching for signs of deception or hidden knowledge. The giant warrior met her gaze steadily, his pale blue eyes reflecting neither guilt nor evasion, but something far more troubling, the recognition of patterns he'd hoped never to see again. You know something, she said, her voice carrying the authority her father had taught her to project when seeking truth. Your arrival here isn't coincidence, is it? Halvor pushed his bowl aside and leaned back against the carved bench, his massive frame settling with the weight of decision. 3 months ago, in a tavern 2 days' ride south of here, I overheard a conversation that troubled me deeply. 2 men speaking in low voices about a hunting expedition that would venture into the deep wilderness, tracking prey worth more than any beast's pelt. Runa's hand moved instinctively to her sword hilt. What kind of prey requires hunting men instead of animals? The kind that carries value beyond simple flesh and bone, Halvor replied grimly. One of the men mentioned Erik and Bjorn by name, describing them as the key to claiming inheritance that had been hidden for 3 decades. Henrik leaned forward, his weathered features sharp with concern. You believe someone has discovered their true parentage and sees profit in that knowledge? Erik Goldenheart came from merchant wealth, Halvor explained. His family controlled trading routes that stretched from the northern settlements to the southern kingdoms. When he died, without claiming his inheritance, that wealth passed to distant cousins who had no knowledge of potential heirs. The pieces began forming a picture that chilled Signe more than any winter wind. Someone learned about the boys' heritage and decided to eliminate them before they could claim what's rightfully theirs. Or capture them alive to use as leverage against the remaining family holdings, Halvor said. Dead men can't sign legal documents transferring ownership, but living heirs under duress can be persuaded to renounce claims in exchange for their freedom. Runa stood abruptly and began pacing before the great hearth, her warrior's energy seeking outlet in movement. Who were these men you overheard? Did you recognize them? Halvor's expression darkened further. One carried himself like a sellsword, scarred hands, weapons worn from use rather than display, eyes that missed nothing of tactical importance. The other was clearly the employer, well-dressed and soft-handed, but with the calculating demeanor of someone accustomed to buying solutions to complex problems. "And you did nothing to warn our family?" Signe asked, her voice carrying an edge of accusation. "I followed them for 2 days, trying to learn their intentions more precisely," Halvor replied, meeting her anger with calm dignity. "By the time I understood the full scope of their plans, they had already departed for the northern territories. I came here as quickly as winter travel allowed, hoping to arrive before any harm could be done." Henrik opened Magnus's ledger again, flipping through pages with urgent purpose. "There must be documentation of Eirik's family connections, some record of the wealth you describe." "Here," he said, stopping at an entry dated shortly after Erik and Bjorn's birth. Magnus writes, "I have received word through trading networks that young Eirik's family has prospered greatly in his absence, expanding their commercial interests throughout the eastern territories. His father has formally declared him dead and divided his inheritance among surviving relatives. The boys will grow up knowing nothing of this lost legacy, which may be for the best. Wealth built on the bones of fallen warriors brings its own curses." The irony struck them all simultaneously. Magnus had deliberately shielded the boys from knowledge that might have protected them, choosing instead to raise them as his own sons without the complications of competing loyalties. That protective choice had left them vulnerable to threats they couldn't have anticipated. "We need to organize a search party," Runa declared. "Every day we delay gives these men more time to accomplish their goals." 6 weeks have passed since your brothers disappeared, Halvor pointed out. "If they're still alive, they're being held somewhere secure enough that casual searching won't locate them. We need strategy, not just determination." Signe moved to her father's great chair, settling into the carved seat where Magnus had made countless decisions affecting Korrstad's prosperity and safety. The weight of leadership pressed down on her shoulders, but with it came clarity about what needed to be done. "Tell us everything you know about these men," she commanded. "Their appearance, their weapons, any hints about their base of operations or methods." Halvor reached into his travel pack and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. When he unwrapped it, they saw a silver medallion bearing the embossed image of a coiled serpent. The sellsword wore this openly, as if proud of whatever organization it represents. Henrik examined the medallion with growing alarm. "I've seen this symbol before, years ago, when Magnus was dealing with problems along our southern borders. It belongs to a group that calls itself the Serpent's Coil Mercenaries, who specialize in acquiring wealth through violence and intimidation." "Mercenaries don't work for free," Signe observed. "Someone with substantial resources hired them, someone who stands to gain significantly from eliminating or controlling Erik and Bjorn. The current holders of Eirik's inheritance," Halvor confirmed. "Distant cousins who have enjoyed 30 years of prosperity built on wealth that should have passed to his legitimate heirs. If the boy's true parentage became known and legally established, those cousins would lose everything." Runa stopped pacing and faced them all with fierce determination. "Then we give them what they want, or make them think we will. We use their greed against them." "What do you propose?" Henrik asked. "We let it be known that we've discovered the truth about our brother's heritage," she said. "We announce that we're prepared to pursue their legal claims to Eirik's inheritance, that we have documentation and witnesses to support those claims." Signe understood immediately. "Draw the mercenaries back here, force them to come to us instead of hiding in whatever stronghold they've chosen." "It's dangerous," Halvor warned. "Men like the Serpent's Coil don't hesitate to kill entire families if it serves their purposes. Then they'll discover that Magnus the Stoutheart raised daughters who know how to fight for what they love," Signe replied. "Expect knowledge of our own territory, friends who will stand with us, and most importantly, the truth about what's at stake. She stood from her father's chair, feeling the mantle of leadership settle around her like inherited armor. "Henrik, send word to our allies in the surrounding settlements. Tell them Korrstad may need their support in the days ahead." "And what of me?" Halvor asked. Signe studied his weathered features, seeing beyond the battle-scarred exterior to the man who had carried guilt and purpose across 3 decades of wandering. "You came here to honor the dead and serve the living. If you're willing, we need someone who understands how these mercenaries think and fight." "I've spent 30 years running from the consequences of choices made in haste," Halvor replied. "Perhaps it's time to make a stand that honors both the fallen and those still breathing." Outside, snow continued to fall, but within the longhouse, the fires of determination burned bright. Against the gathering darkness, 3 days passed in careful preparation. Messengers had been dispatched to allied settlements, weapons sharpened, and defensive positions established around Korrstad's approaches. The longhouse itself had been transformed into a fortress of sorts, with additional supplies stockpiled and escape routes planned should the worst come to pass. Halvor proved invaluable in these preparations, his knowledge of siege tactics and defensive strategy evident in every suggestion he offered. On the 4th morning, as dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of rose and gold, Henrik arrived at the longhouse carrying news that would change everything they thought they understood about their situation. "A messenger came during the night," he announced breathlessly, snow still clinging to his heavy cloak. "A young woman, barely more than a child, half frozen and terrified beyond measure. She carried word from the deep wilderness, from men claiming to be Erik and Bjorn." Signe felt her heart leap with hope and terror in equal measure. "They're alive. Where are they?" Henrik's expression remained grim despite the potentially good news. "That's where the situation becomes complicated. The message claims they're being held in the old mining settlement at Ironbrook Falls, 2 days' hard ride through dangerous terrain. But something about the messenger's story troubles me deeply." Runa moved closer, her warrior's instincts alert to nuances others might miss. "What kind of trouble?" "The girl described our brothers in detail that suggested intimate knowledge of their appearance and mannerisms," Henrik explained. "But when I asked her to repeat specific words Erik supposedly spoke to her, her account changed with each telling." Halvor's massive hands clenched into fists as understanding dawned in his pale eyes. "A trap. Someone coached the girl carefully, but not carefully enough to fool someone who knew the boys personally. That was my conclusion as well," Henrik confirmed. "But there's more. The messenger carried this with her, claiming Erik gave it to her as proof of his identity." He reached into his cloak and withdrew an object that struck them all like a physical blow, a silver arm ring bearing intricate runic inscriptions, identical in every detail to one of the artifacts from Halvor's wooden crates. Signe stared at the ring in confusion and growing dread. "That's impossible. The original is still in your crate, wrapped in oiled leather exactly as you brought it here. Which means someone has created an exact duplicate," Halvor said grimly, taking the false ring and examining it with expert eyes. "The craftsmanship is exceptional. Few silversmiths would possess the skill to replicate runic inscriptions with this level of accuracy." The implications hit them like avalanche stones. Not only had the mercenaries discovered the truth about Erik and Bjorn's heritage, but they possessed detailed knowledge of the artifacts Halvor carried. Someone had provided them with information that should have been impossible to obtain. "How could they know about Thorvald's arm ring?" Runa demanded. "You said yourself that you've told no one the specific details of what you carry." Halvor's face had gone pale beneath his weathered beard. "I haven't spoken of it to anyone except—" He stopped mid-sentence, his expression transforming from confusion to horrible understanding. "Except whom?" Signe pressed, though she was beginning to suspect an answer she desperately didn't want to hear. "Thorvald's son," Halvor said quietly. "When I delivered his father's belongings last summer, I showed him everything in detail. He wept to see items he remembered from childhood stories his mother had told him about his father's war years. Henrik leaned forward, his weathered features sharp with concern. "You believe he's involved in this conspiracy?" "I believe I was a fool," Halvor replied with bitter self-recrimination. A lonely old warrior carrying guilt and desperate to find absolution. I spoke too freely about my mission, about the other families I still needed to reach. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Thorvald's son had learned about Eirik's surviving bloodline and the inheritance they represented. Whether through greed, desperation, or simple opportunism, he had betrayed Halvor's trust and allied himself with those who saw profit in eliminating inconvenient heirs. "The question now," Signe said grimly, "is whether our brothers are actually being held at Ironbrook Falls, or if this entire message is designed to draw us away from Korrstad for some other purpose." Runa moved to the window, studying the winter landscape with tactical awareness. "If I wanted to eliminate the remaining heirs to Eirik's fortune, I wouldn't just target the boys. I'd need to ensure that no one else could press their claims or seek justice for their sires. Deaths. You'd target the sisters who might seek revenge," Henrik concluded. "Draw them out of their stronghold with false hope, then ambush them in terrain that favors attackers over defenders." Halvor stood abruptly and moved to his wooden crates, his movements sharp with angry purpose. "There's something else," he said, reaching deep into the second crate. "Something I haven't told you, about Eirik's belongings." He withdrew a bundle wrapped in black silk, handling it with even greater reverence than the other artifacts. When he unwrapped it, they saw a blade unlike any weapon Signe had ever encountered, a seax with a curved blade that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. Its handle wrapped in wire that gleamed like silver but felt different beneath the touch. "Eirik's grandfather was more than just a merchant," Halvor explained. "He was a wanderer who traveled to the far eastern lands, beyond even the territories we know. This blade was forged using techniques that died out before our grandfathers' grandfathers were born." He held the weapon reverently, and Signe could see something like fear in his eyes. The metal was star iron, metal that fell from the heavens. The runes carved into the blade aren't just decorative, they're functional, created by smiths who understood that some weapons are forged not just to cut flesh, but to cut through deception itself. Runa stared at the blade with fascination and growing understanding. "You're saying this weapon can reveal truth?" "I'm saying that when I touch this blade, I can sense the intentions of those around me," Halvor replied. "It's how I knew immediately that your hospitality was genuine, that your family poses no threat to my mission." He turned the weapon toward Henrik, and the old man's eyes widened, as if he could see something invisible becoming suddenly clear. "And right now, it's telling me that the messenger who brought word of your brother's capture carried more than just false hope." Signe felt ice forming in her veins that had nothing to do with winter cold. What else did she carry? Halvor's pale eyes met hers directly, and in their depths she saw the reflection of betrayal beyond anything they'd yet imagined. "The scent of your brother's blood," he said quietly. "Fresh blood, recently spilled." The revelation struck them like lightning, illuminating a landscape of deception that stretched far beyond simple greed or inheritance disputes. Someone had used their brothers not just as leverage, but as bait in a trap designed to eliminate the entire bloodline that might threaten carefully maintained lies. "They're not holding Erik and Bjorn prisoner," Signe said, her voice hollow with terrible understanding. "They're using their deaths to lure us into an ambush. And we're going to give them exactly what they expect," Runa declared, her warrior's spirit rising to meet the challenge. "But not in the way they anticipate." Outside, snow continued to fall, but within the longhouse, the air itself seemed to crackle with the energy of plans forming and destinies converging toward a confrontation that would determine whether justice or greed would triumph in the frozen wilderness. The war council that formed around the longhouse's central table carried the weight of generations. Maps of the surrounding territory were spread across the scarred wooden surface, marked with paths, defensive positions, and likely approach routes for attackers who believed they were hunting easy prey. Candles burned low as the afternoon wore toward evening, casting dancing shadows that seemed to mirror the strategies taking shape in their minds. "They'll expect us to ride toward Ironbrook Falls," Signe said, tracing potential routes with her finger. Two sisters, desperate to save their brothers, charging into obvious danger without proper planning or adequate forces. Halvor studied the maps with the practiced eye of someone who had planned countless engagements across similar terrain. The trail to Ironbrook passes through Raven's Gap, a natural choke point where a small force can control movement for miles. "If I were planning an ambush, I'd position archers on the heights and cavalry in the approaches." Runa leaned across the table, her warrior's instincts engaged fully in tactical analysis. "But what if we give them the battle they're planning, just not the way they expect it to unfold?" Henrik looked up from sharpening his old blade, a weapon that hadn't seen combat in 15 years, but still held a keen edge. "What do you propose?" "We divide our forces," she explained, excitement building in her voice. "Signe and I ride toward the gap as expected, but with enough men to make a real fight of it when the trap springs. Meanwhile, Halvor leads a second group through the northern passes, circling behind their positions." "The northern route adds a full day to the journey," Halvor pointed out. "In winter conditions, it's treacherous even for experienced mountain travelers." "Which is exactly why they won't expect anyone to use it," Signe said, understanding her sister's strategy immediately. "They'll position all their forces to control the obvious approaches, leaving their flanks vulnerable to attack from unexpected directions." The plan was audacious, requiring precise timing and courage from fighters who had lived in peace for years. But as they discussed details and contingencies, it became clear that their enemies had made a crucial error. They had underestimated the depth of loyalty commanded by Magnus the Stoutheart's daughters. Throughout the afternoon, men from surrounding settlements arrived in response to Henrik's messages. Farmers who had learned swordplay in their youth, hunters whose skills with bow and spear translated naturally to warfare, traders who understood that Korrstad's prosperity was linked to their own survival. By evening, they had assembled a force of 37. Fighters not large by the standards of armies, but sufficient for the kind of engagement they were planning. As night settled over the longhouse, Halvor found himself standing alone in the courtyard, gazing up at stars that gleamed like chips of ice against the black sky. The star Iron CX hung at his side, its presence a constant reminder of responsibilities that stretched beyond simple vengeance into realms of justice and honor. Signe joined him in the courtyard, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "Henrik tells me you've spent 30 years carrying guilt over choices made in a single battle. Tonight, you have chance to write a different ending to that story. Or repeat the same mistakes that got good men killed," Halvor replied. "Leadership in battle requires certainty I'm not sure I still possess." She studied his weathered profile in the starlight, seeing beyond the scarred exterior to the man who had carried artifacts of the dead across countless miles rather than abandoned promises made to dying friends. "My father taught me that true leadership isn't about being certain of victory. It's about being willing to stand for what's right, even when the outcome remains unclear." Inside the longhouse, they could hear the sounds of men preparing for combat, weapons being checked, armor strapped into place, final letters written to families who might never see their husbands and fathers return. The weight of those lives pressed down on both leaders like a mountain of responsibility. "The young woman who brought the false message," Signe said quietly. "Where is she now?" "Henrik has her secured in the storage building," Halvor replied. "She's terrified beyond measure, but she's also protecting someone, probably family members, who are being held as leverage for her cooperation. After we settle accounts with the Serpent's Coil, we'll find whoever she's trying to protect and ensure their safety," Signe promised. "She's as much a victim in this as anyone else." Runa emerged from the longhouse, wearing mail that had belonged to their father, the linked rings gleaming dully in the starlight. At her side hung the sword Magnus had carried during his own war years, its leather grip worn smooth by hands that had known both battle and peace. "The men are ready," she reported. "They understand the risks and choose to stand with us anyway." Henrik followed her into the courtyard, his own preparations complete. Despite his years, the old warrior moved with confidence that spoke of skills that never truly fade. "Word has come from our scouts. Enemy forces are indeed moving toward Raven's Gap, at least 20 mounted fighters and twice that number on foot." "Professional soldiers," Halvor observed. "The Serpent's Coil has invested significantly in this operation, which confirms how much wealth they're protecting," Signe said grimly. "Eirik's inheritance must be substantial to justify this level of expense and risk." As they made final preparations, Halvor retrieved the last item from his wooden crates, a horn carved from walrus ivory, its surface covered with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the flickering light. "This belonged to my company commander during the war years," he explained. "When blown, it carries farther than any normal horn, and its sound cannot be mistaken for anything else." He handed the horn to Signe with ceremonial gravity. "When your part of the battle is joined, sound 3 long blasts. No matter where I am in the northern passes, I'll hear it and know to begin the flanking attack." The exchange felt like passing of ancient authority, connecting present struggles to battles fought by previous generations. In the horn's carved surface, Signe could see reflections of her father's war years, of choices that had shaped the peaceful life she'd known, of responsibilities that now fell to her and Runa to uphold. "And if something goes wrong?" she asked. "If we're overmatched or the trap proves more complex than we anticipate?" Halvor's pale eyes met hers with complete steadiness. "Then we make our stand worthy of the stories that will be told afterward. Your brothers' deaths will be avenged, and their true heritage will be known to future generations." The night air carried the sound of horses being saddled and final gear being loaded onto pack animals. In a few hours, they would ride out into darkness that might be their last, carrying with them hopes for justice and fears for survival in equal measure. "There's something else," Henrik said quietly, producing a small object wrapped in soft cloth. "I found this among Magnus's private effects, hidden where even you girls wouldn't have discovered it." He unwrapped the cloth to reveal a ring identical to Eirik's betrothal ring, but bearing different runic inscriptions along its band. "Your father commissioned this from the same silversmith who created the original, but he had it inscribed with blessings for the sons he chose to claim as his own." Signe accepted the ring with trembling hands, understanding immediately its significance. Magnus had known the truth about Erik and Bjorn's heritage, but he had also chosen to create new symbols of belonging that transcended questions of blood and birth. "He planned to give this to them when they came of age to marry," Henrik explained, "as a reminder that family is built through choice as much as lineage." The discovery added another layer of meaning to their mission. They weren't just avenging murdered brothers or reclaiming stolen inheritance. They were fighting to honor a father's love that had encompassed all his children equally, regardless of their origins. As the first hints of dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, the two groups prepared to separate and begin their respective journeys toward confrontation. The longhouse that had sheltered them through revelation and planning now stood empty, except for essential guards, its halls echoing with the absence of those who might never return. "Whatever happens in the hours ahead," Signe said to their assembled fighters, "know that you ride in defense of truth itself. The men we face have chosen to build their prosperity on lies and murder. We offer them opportunity to face justice honestly, or learn that some debts can only be paid in blood." The star-iron CX at Halvor's side seemed to pulse with cold light as he mounted his horse, and in that moment, all present felt the weight of destiny, settling around them like inherited armor, binding them to consequences that would echo through generations yet to come. The approach to Raven's Gap unfolded exactly as Halvor had predicted. Rocky walls rose on both sides of the narrow pass, their heights perfect for positioning archers who could rain death down on travelers trapped in the confined space below. Fresh snow had fallen during the night, muffling hoofbeats but also revealing tracks that confirmed enemy presence. Signe rode at the head of 20 fighters, her father's war banner flying proudly despite the circumstances that had brought them to this frozen battlefield. The ivory horn hung at her saddle, ready to sound the signal that would bring Halvor's flanking force into action. "There," Runa said quietly, pointing toward barely visible movement on the eastern ridge. "Archers, positioned to cover the narrows ahead." Henrik squinted through the morning light, his old warrior's eyes picking out details younger men might miss, and cavalry waiting in the rocks beyond the pass. They had ridden into the trap exactly as their enemies expected, but with full knowledge of what awaited them. Everything now depended on Halvor's ability to navigate the treacherous northern passes and arrive at the crucial moment. "Remember the plan," Signe called to their fighters. "We advance until they commit to the attack, then hold position and make them come to us." The pass narrowed further as they rode, deeper into the gap, and Signe could feel dozens of eyes watching from concealed positions. Then the first arrow whistled past her head, striking sparks from stone. The ambush had begun. "Shields!" Runa roared, and their small formation contracted into a protective circle as arrows began falling like deadly rain. Most of the shafts struck harmlessly against raised shields or buried themselves in snow, but the occasional cry of pain indicated that not all their fighters had escaped the initial volley. From the heights above came triumphant shouts as the serpent's coil revealed their positions, no longer concerned with concealment, now that battle was joined. Signe counted at least 30 archers spread across both ridges, with more fighters visible as they moved to better positions. "They're not attacking," Henrik observed, blood running from a shallow cut where an arrow had grazed his cheek. "They're content to pin us here while their main force moves into position." Understanding struck Signe like a physical blow. The ambush was more sophisticated than they'd anticipated, not a simple trap designed to kill them quickly, but a deliberate strategy to capture them alive. Dead heirs couldn't renounce inheritance claims, but living ones could be tortured into signing whatever documents their enemies required. "They want us alive," she called to her fighters. "That gives us advantages they don't expect." As if summoned by her words, mounted warriors emerged from concealment beyond the pass, heavily armed, professional soldiers who moved with the disciplined precision of men accustomed to violence as a trade. Their leader rode a massive black stallion and wore mail that gleamed despite the overcast sky. Even at distance, his bearing suggested someone accustomed to command and confident of victory. "Daughters of Magnus," the leader called, his voice carrying clearly across the narrow space between their forces. "I am Grimvar the Ruthless, captain of the Serpents. Coil, you will lay down your weapons and surrender yourselves to my custody." Signe urged her horse forward a few steps, close enough for conversation, but still within the protective circle of her fighters. "We're here for our brothers Erik and Bjorn. Return them unharmed, and we'll consider your terms." Grimvar's laughter was like the sound of breaking glass. "Your brothers proved uncooperative in their final hours. They died badly, but they died knowing that their bloodline dies with them." The confirmation of what they'd already suspected still struck like hammer blows to the heart. Erik and Bjorn were truly gone, murdered by men who saw human lives as obstacles to be removed rather than sacred things to be protected. Rage burned in Signe's chest, but she channeled it into cold determination rather than reckless action. "Then you've gained nothing by this treachery," she replied. "Dead men can't sign away inheritance rights, and their deaths only strengthen our claims to justice. Justice belongs to those strong enough to claim it." Grimvar shot back. "You and your sister will live long enough to transfer all legal rights to Erik's estate to my employers. After that, your usefulness will be concluded." The mercenary captain raised his hand, and Signe could see additional fighters moving into position, more cavalry emerging from hidden approaches, foot soldiers climbing down from the heights to close off any possibility of retreat. They were outnumbered 3-1, trapped in terrain that favored their enemies, facing professional killers who had already demonstrated their willingness to murder innocents. But they had one advantage that Grimvar couldn't anticipate somewhere in the northern passes. Halvor Iceborn was leading his own force through snow and ice toward positions that would allow him to strike at exactly the moment when enemy attention was focused elsewhere. "Form ranks," Runa commanded their fighters, and 20 men who had lived as farmers and craftsmen transformed themselves into a battle line that would have made their warrior ancestors proud. Shields locked together, spears leveled, every man understanding that they fought not just for the women who led them, but for the principle that murder and greed couldn't be allowed to triumph over justice and honor. Grimvar's forces advanced slowly, confident in their overwhelming numerical advantage. Arrows continued to fall from the heights, though less frequently now that the archers risked hitting their own men. The sound of approaching hoofbeats echoed off the rocky walls like rolling thunder. Signe gripped the ivory horn, waiting for the precise moment when enemy forces would be fully committed to frontal assault and unable to respond quickly to threats from unexpected directions. Everything depended on timing too early, and Halvor's flanking attack would face prepared defenders too late, and her own force would be overrun before help could arrive. The first clash came as Grimvar's cavalry struck their shield wall with the force of an avalanche. Spear points found gaps in mail, swords rang against shields, horses screamed, and men died in the confusion of close combat. But the line held. Farmers and hunters, proving that courage could match professional skill when the cause was just. Through the chaos, Signe saw movement on the western ridge shapes that didn't belong, fighters approaching from angles that suggested they'd climbed impossible routes to reach positions behind enemy lines. Halvor had accomplished the seemingly impossible, bringing his force through the northern passes in time to strike at the crucial moment. She raised the ivory horn to her lips and blew 3 long, clear notes that echoed across the battlefield like the voice of destiny itself. The 3 horn blasts echoed across Raven's Gap like the voice of ancient gods calling warriors to final judgment. As the last note died away, chaos erupted on the heights above as Halvor's force struck the enemy archers from behind. The star iron siegs gleamed in his massive hands as he carved through unprepared defenders, its otherworldly metal cutting through mail and bone with equal ease. From her position in the shield wall below, Signe watched arrows cease falling as the archers found themselves fighting for their lives against enemies who had appeared like ghosts from impossible terrain. Halvor moved through their ranks like winter storm given human form, his pale eyes burning with 30 years of accumulated purpose finally finding release. "Press the attack." Runa roared, and their formation surged forward as Grimvar's cavalry suddenly found themselves caught between 2 forces. The mercenary captain's confident demeanor cracked as he realized his carefully planned ambush had become a trap for his own men. The star iron siegs pulsed with cold fire as Halvor reached the edge of the eastern ridge. Without hesitation, he leaped down into the main battle, landing among the enemy cavalry with impact that sent 3 horses stumbling and their riders crashing to the frozen ground. The blade in his hands seemed to anticipate his opponent's moves, guiding his strikes with supernatural precision. Grimvar spurred his black stallion toward this new threat, his own sword gleaming as he sought to eliminate the giant who had turned certain victory into desperate struggle. "You're too late, old man," he snarled. The boys died, screaming for mercy that never came. Halvor's response was wordless fury, channeled through 3 feet of star-forged steel. The siegs met Grimvar's blade with a sound like breaking thunder, and the mercenary's weapon shattered as if it were made of glass rather than honest iron. Shock replaced arrogance in the captain's eyes as he realized he faced something beyond normal human ability. "Where are their bodies?" Halvor demanded, his voice carrying over the din of battle. The Sikhs pointed unerringly at Grimvar's heart, its point steady despite the chaos surrounding them. "The wolves have them now." Grimvar spat, drawing a backup blade. "Food for carrion, like you'll be when this is." He never finished the threat. The star-iron Sikhs moved faster than thought, opening the mercenary's throat in one precise cut that silenced his boasts forever. Grimvar toppled from his saddle, his blood steaming in the cold air, as his spirit departed for whatever judgment awaited those who murdered innocents for gold. With their leader dead and their tactical advantage destroyed, the serpent's coil began to break. Some fought with desperate courage, others sought escape through routes that no longer existed. Halvor's flanking force controlled the heights, while Signe and Runa's fighters blocked the pass itself. There would be no retreat for those who had chosen murder as their profession. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably mere minutes. Steel rang against steel, men cried out in pain and fury, horses screamed as they fell wounded among the rocks. But the outcome was never truly in doubt once the initial ambush failed. Farmers and hunters fighting for justice proved more than match for mercenaries fighting only for coin. As the last enemy fighter fell, an unnatural silence settled over Raven's Gap. Smoke rose from scattered fires where arrows had struck dry wood, and the snow was stained red with blood of the guilty and innocent alike. But justice had been served, and the serpent's coil would threaten no more families seeking to claim what was rightfully theirs. Halvor stood among the bodies of his enemies, the star-iron Sikhs hanging loose in his grip. For 30 years he had carried the weight of choices made in desperate moments, wondering if he would ever find peace with his past failures. Now, surrounded by the consequences of righteous action, he felt that burden begin to lift. Signe approached him carefully, recognizing that men who had been pushed to violence sometimes needed time to return from the dark places battle required them to visit. "It's finished," she said gently. "They've paid for what they took from our family." "Almost finished," Halvor corrected, his pale eyes scanning the battlefield for something specific. Grimvar spoke of wolves having the boys' bodies, but men like him don't leave valuable evidence where scavengers can find it. Runa wiped blood from her blade, her warrior's instincts still alert despite their victory. "You believe their bodies are nearby?" "I believe the star iron can lead us to them," Halvor replied. This blade was forged to cut through deception and reveal hidden truths. "If Erik and Bjorn are within miles of this place, it will guide us to where they rest." The sea axe began to glow with soft light as Halvor held it before him like a lodestone seeking true north. The blade pulled gently toward the north face of the western ridge, where caves and crevices offered concealment for those who needed to hide their crimes from discovery. "There," he said, pointing toward a shadowed depression barely visible among the rocks. "They're there." The climb to the cave was treacherous, made more dangerous by ice and loose stone disturbed during the battle. But when they finally reached the hidden entrance, they found what they had feared to discover: the bodies of Erik and Bjorn, arranged with care that suggested their killers had retained some vestige of respect for the dead, despite their other crimes. The brothers lay side by side, their weapons beside them, their faces peaceful despite the violence of their final moments. They had died as Magnus taught them to live, standing together, protecting each other until the end. Signe knelt beside them, her tears falling like drops of molten silver onto their cold faces. "We found justice for you," she whispered. "Your true heritage is known, and your killers have paid the price for their greed." Halvor reached into his pack and withdrew Eirik's betrothal ring, the garnets gleaming like drops of blood in the pale light. With infinite gentleness, he placed it in Erik's hands, finally completing a promise made 30 years past. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. Both of them would. 3 months later, spring began its tentative return to Korrstad. Ice released its grip on the streams that fed the settlement, and the first green shoots appeared in sheltered places where snow had melted earliest. In the longhouse that had witnessed so much revelation and planning, a different kind of gathering was taking place, one focused on healing rather than vengeance. Signe stood before the great hearth where she had first welcomed Halvor Iceborn on that winter night that seemed both recent and ancient. The wooden crates that had carried artifacts of the dead were gone now, their contents finally delivered to their proper destinations. But new items occupied places of honor throughout the hall. Erik and Bjorn's weapons, cleaned and oiled, displayed where they would be seen and remembered by future generations. The legal documents arrived yesterday, Henrik announced, entering the hall with a leather satchel that bore official seals. Erik's inheritance has been formally transferred to his son's estate, with you and Runa named as administrators until such time as you choose to establish a memorial foundation in their honor. The wealth was substantial: trading routes, properties, investments that had grown for 30 years under careful management. More than enough to ensure Korrstad's prosperity for generations, to build schools and hospitals, to create lasting good from tragedy that might have destroyed a lesser family. Halvor sat in the chair that had become his customary place during the long winter evenings of recovery that followed their return from Raven's Gap. The star-iron seeks rested across his knees, its supernatural gleam dimmed to something that seemed almost normal, though those who looked closely could still see depths in the metal that suggested mysteries beyond common understanding. "And the girl who carried the false message?" Runa asked, settling into her own chair with movements that still favored her left shoulder, where an enemy arrow had found its mark during the battle. "Reunited with her family, as promised," Henrik replied. "Her younger brothers were being held to ensure her cooperation. They're safe now, and she understands that speaking of what she experienced will only bring more danger to those she loves." The mercy they had shown to their enemy's unwilling accomplice reflected lessons learned from Magnus the Stoutheart, who had always taught that justice required wisdom as much as strength. The girl had been a victim of the same greed that claimed Erik and Bjorn. Punishing her would have served no useful purpose. Through the open windows, they could hear sounds of normal life returning to the Konpoloj settlement. Children played in courtyards where snow had recently given way to muddy ground. Merchants discussed spring trading expeditions. Craftsmen prepared for the busy season of repair and construction that followed every winter. Korrstad was healing, moving forward while honoring what had been lost. "I've been thinking about our conversation that first night," Signe said to Halvor, her voice thoughtful as she studied flames dancing in the hearth. "You spoke of debts that weighed on your soul, of promises that couldn't be abandoned simply because they became inconvenient." Halvor nodded slowly, understanding where her words were leading. 30 years of carrying guilt, seeking absolution that I wasn't certain existed. "And now?" she asked. He was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands stroking the star-iron blade with movements that had become unconscious habit. "Now I understand that some debts can only be paid by choosing to live differently, by using whatever years remain to build rather than simply remember." The transformation in the giant warrior was remarkable to those who had known him only during the winter months of revelation and conflict. Where once he had carried himself like a man burdened by unfinished obligations, now he moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had found peace with his past and purpose for his future. "Korrstad could use a war leader," Runa observed, her comment casual but clearly intentional. "Someone to train our fighters, plan our defenses, ensure that what happened to our family never happens to others." "Is that an offer?" Halvor asked, a slight smile creasing his weathered features. "It's a recognition that some wanderers find their true home only after traveling impossible distances," Signe replied. "Father always said that the strongest foundations are built by those who have learned the cost of their destruction." The offer hung in the air like incense, carrying implications that reached far beyond simple employment. They were inviting him to become part of their family in truth, to find the belonging that had eluded him through decades of solitary wandering. I've spent so long moving toward destinations that I never considered what I might do when the journey ended, Halvor mused. Perhaps it's time to learn what it means to stay in one place long enough to watch things grow. As afternoon faded toward evening, the four of them sat in comfortable silence, each lost in contemplation of paths that had led them to this moment. The great hearth that had warmed Magnus's family for 2 generations now sheltered a new arrangement of lives, bound together by choice rather than blood, strengthened by trials that had tested their deepest convictions. Outside, the first warm rain of spring began to fall, washing away the last remnants of snow and preparing the ground for new growth. In the longhouse of Korrstad, surrounded by artifacts of the past and plans for the future, unlikely companions discovered that sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in enemies defeated, but in family bonds forged strong enough to honor both the living and the dead. The star-iron siegs caught the firelight one last time, its ancient metal reflecting not the cold gleam of supernatural power, but the warm glow of purpose finally fulfilled and peace finally found.